BC has a unique history in Canada in terms of our green building, and it's worth revisiting that to show like what happened. So originally, the Green Building BC panel was created, and this was a sort of a committee of both governments. So there was the Ministry of Competition, Science and Enterprise, the City of Vancouver, the Greater Vancouver Regional District, now Metro Vancouver, BC Building Corporations, BC Hydro, and BC Gas created that group. And at the time, we had no rating systems in BC. And they commissioned Ray Cole from the University of British Columbia to do a study of all the rating systems that were available at that time for new construction. So he looked at everything that was out there and came back with LEED as the best candidate for BC in terms of our ability to adapt it to Canada. It was a North American standard. It referenced other North American standards like ASHRAE that our designers are familiar with. And so that was how LEED came to be the predominant rating system in British Columbia. If you go elsewhere in North America, that's not actually the case. As you head further east, green globes is much more popular. But you do not see a lot of green globes for new construction here in BC. And this is part of the reason. So when he came back with LEED, BC then became a chapter of the US Green Building Council, because the Canada Green Building Council didn't exist at that point in time. So BC became a chapter, and we licensed LEED from the USGBC and created LEED BC. Not very many people have heard of LEED BC. It was in place for maybe 6 months before the Canada Green Building Council released LEED Canada. So it is not a well-known rating system, but we were first. We were the first group to license LEED outside of the US, in fact. So anywhere in the world, BC was first in that. So we were a chapter of the USGBC, but Cascadia was in existence. Cascadia was a chapter including Oregon and Washington. And there was enough similarities between us that we joined Cascadia and became a cross-border chapter of the USGBC. Then in 2002, the CAGBC was formed, and they released LEED Canada in 2004, shortly after the release of LEED BC, as I mentioned. Cascadia didn't join the CAGBC until 2006 because there was a number of issues with us being both a US chapter and a Canadian chapter, and so those had to be worked out before we could join the Canada Green Building Council. So whereas Cascadia is one of the original chapters of the US, unfortunately we're not one of the original chapters of Canada because of those issues that needed to be worked out. So we joined the CAGBC in 2006, and we also released as a chapter the Living Building Challenge in 2006. So Jason McLennan, who is the author of the challenge, became Cascadia's CEO, and the challenge was released by Cascadia. So concurrently to this, Green Globes was under development. You'll notice I'm at a podium here. It's because I have notes. This is accommodating our aging population. So, forgive me while I refer to these notes. So the genesis of the system was the BREEAM, the Building Research Establishment's Environmental Assessment Method, which was brought to Canada in 1996 when the Canadian Standards Association, CSA, published BREEAM Canada for existing buildings. So a more streamlined question-based tool was introduced as BREEAM Green Leaf Eco Rating System in 1999. Then in 2000, BREEAM Green Leaf became an online assessment tool and fell under the name of Green Globes that we are all familiar with. So it's Green Globes for existing buildings. That same year, BREEAM Green Leaf for the design of new buildings was developed for the Department of National Defence and Public Works and Government Services Canada. So in 2002, work began to adapt that BREEAM Green Leaf for design of new buildings, into the online green globes for new buildings. And then in 2004, green globes for existing building was adopted by BOMA. And it became the Go Green Comprehensive, later Go Green Plus, and now we know it as Go Green Best. So that was the evolution of green globes concurrently with LEED. But in B.Sc, both rating systems are used basically for the intent that they were first created. So LEED for new construction is our primary rating system here, and then BOMA Best is the primary rating system for certifying existing buildings. So we have a new release of LEED coming out that's fairly different than the previous releases of LEED. And only about half of you have worked on LEED projects. So why would LEED be important to you?
I work at a public institution. The permanent government says I must do LEED projects.
Right. And that's one of the other differences that we see in B.Sc. Because this is a largely government-driven initiative, I mentioned all the agencies that were that Green Building B.Sc roundtable. Government bodies require LEED for their own projects. So the City of Vancouver, many other municipalities, the regional district, the government of B.Sc, anything that they fund has to be LEED. It is also good to know LEED because where LEED goes or where rating systems go, code follows. Okay? And we've seen that in B.Sc. And Kevin mentioned this morning, regulation trumps culture. So that's what we're seeing with green building. We're seeing the code catch up to our green building rating systems. And in some areas surpass them. It's a little bit embarrassing, but there's areas of the US where their own energy requirements are higher than LEED requirements. So the code is a little bit better than LEED buildings. But because LEED version 4 is an international version, it needs to be applicable across the board. So that's one of the main changes to version 4. Each country will have their own paths, alternative compliance paths, wherever a credit or prerequisite doesn't strictly apply to us. So there'll be an alternative means of earning those. And I won't go into LEED in detail, but I will highlight some of the differences between what we have used for the past 13 years and this new version of LEED, because there are a lot of changes. Another big change is that our certifications will go through the US rather than the Canada Green Building Council. So we will be using LEED Online, that's new for us, and it will go to the Green Building Certification Institute. Our projects will go there for certification. However, all of those projects will go to Canadian review teams. So our review teams, the people that look at the submissions to see whether or not they met the requirements, those will still be Canadian-based teams that we've had for the full time. But the agency that does it will be through the US. Okay, so some of the changes for building design and construction. We've had new construction with major renovations in Core and Shell for quite some time here. That's the main rating system that is in use here. New to Canada will be specific rating systems for schools, healthcare, and retail. Now, we could always have done those through the US if we chose to once they were released there, but this will be the first time that we have Canadian, those alternative compliance paths for Canada for those rating systems. And then brand new to everywhere is data centers, warehouse and distribution centers, and hospitality. And of course, if you've ever tried to apply LEED to a project that it wasn't written for, it was written for commercial buildings, you will know that it's difficult to do. And you have to do a lot of workarounds in order to apply it to, say, an industrial project. But now we have both data centers and warehouse and distribution centers that are written specifically for those building types. So that's definitely an improvement. And it follows through all of the different umbrellas of the rating systems that LEED has. So not only is there building design and construction, there's also interior design and construction, I, B, and C. And so we have commercial interiors here in Canada already, We will now have retail for commercial interiors and hospitality for commercial interiors as well. So that's added to the portfolio. For existing buildings, all of those new building types will be added to existing building certifications as well. So it will be easier to certify schools, retail, data centers, warehouse and distribution centers, and hospitality as existing buildings. Neighborhood development was always a US-based system. We never had a release of neighborhood development in Canada. So those have been modified, and we will have the alternative compliance maps for those rating systems. Homes, we had in Canada homes for up to 3-story height, so a multi-unit up to 3-story could be registered and certified under the LEED for Homes program, which is a much, much different beast than new construction. Now we can use mid-rise and certify 4 to 8 stories with that new mid-rise rating system that's coming. And in up to 9 to 12 stories, we can choose whether or not we use mid-rise or new construction certification. So those are the certification systems themselves, and then I am sure that you have heard about the differences that have transpired in terms of what's inside the rating system. And we'll look at B, D, and C primarily, building design and construction, so for new construction. So first of all, a new credit has been added for integrative design. So you get credit if you follow aedify on your project. And then sustainable sites has been broken up into 2 now. It's location and transportation. And I don't see sustainable sites on there. But sustainable sites is still there. It's just broken into the 2. And the location and transportation now has many more credits that link to neighborhood development. Water efficiency, there is a new outdoor water use prerequisite, so another must-have in order to certify a project. And the whole water category is more comprehensive. It includes more of the water uses in it. Energy and atmosphere, the minimum energy performance is now 5% above ASHRAE 90.1 2010. So they've updated the standard to which they have to comply. And the minimum energy star score is now 75. There's a new credit for demand response. Building level energy meeting is required, so that's now a prerequisite for all projects. Green power includes carbon offsets. And renewable energy can be community scale central systems. And then there is an enhanced commissioning change. So materials and resources are where most of the changes have taken place. And I was able to hear Mr. Smith speak yesterday that we were using the wrong R. Right? We should be reducing and reusing before we recycle. So he'll be happy to hear that that's what the direction that LEED is going in. They have made building and material reuse the top priority in that category. And they now use life cycle assessment, which is much more holistic, but also much more complicated than the previous version where we just looked at the individual attributes of the materials, whether it was recycled, whether it was local, etc. Now we're looking at life cycle assessment. There's also credits around transparency. So if a product declares what's in it, its ingredients, then you get credit for that under this category. So the movement towards transparency in what is in our building materials. Local has become more local. It's now a 100-mile radius with which we have to source our materials if we want to take advantage of that, but they're worth twice as much in terms of the credit value. So it's shrunk down, and Alan was mentioning that we need to look at a distributed manufacturing sort of network. That's what this encourages. Right now we have very centralized manufacturing where you have, if you go into any commercial building, at least 70% of the carpet that you're walking on will be out of Georgia. That's just where they manufacture carpet. And so the same is true of a number of different materials, but that's not the best paradigm under which to source materials. We should be looking at distributed manufacturing closer to the projects where those materials are going to be. And of course, LEED now encourages that. And there has also been a prerequisite added for waste management planning. So another prerequisite in that category related to waste, construction waste. Indoor environmental quality, low VOC products are now more holistic. You will recall from before they were very categorized. It was an art to figure out what product was in which of those categories. So it now looks at just generally flooring or generally coatings, and you don't need to figure out as much, and it covers more. And then they've also added quality to lighting and views. So before, you could have a view to the outside, didn't matter what it was. Right? It could be a concrete wall, you still got credit for that view. No more. You have to have some access to activity or nature or something else that makes for an interesting view, not just a view to the outside. The same with lighting. It doesn't just need to be controllable, it needs to be controllable at several levels, several different levels. So the cost of LEED. Who was here yesterday, in yesterday's session? Wonderful. So I understand I missed a very interesting discussion on the, I really wish I had been there, on the cost of LEED with Michael Geller. So, and I have, believe me, I have opinions about this. So the cost in Canada to register a project is between $550 for the smallest projects and $3,030 for projects over, I forget what the threshold is, but it's the largest projects that we see certified. So the largest projects will pay $3,300 for registration, and then for certification, the cost is $4,000 for your small projects, $20,000 and a bit of change for the largest projects. So that means that your total cost for registration and certification would be under $25,000 regardless of your project size. Right?
Wrong.
Wrong. That's the cost of registering and certifying. It's not the cost of proving that you've met the requirements, which are all the sunk costs associated with LEED. But I would argue, and I will, if you haven't done that, how do you prove your performance? So where's the proof that you actually met the requirements? If you haven't paid the consultants to provide that documentation, or the contractor to provide that documentation.
Which all goes to the point that LEED is costly.
So is green building though. So is proving that you actually have a green building. When I say so is green building, proving that you have a green building. The problem lies in the accountability. And so the City of Vancouver has had an energy bylaw for many number of years now. Unfortunately, they have no enforcement of it. So what we have seen is that although the buildings in Vancouver are a little bit better in terms of energy performance than the surrounding buildings, because that energy performance is dependent on the architect, the electrical engineer, the mechanical engineer, sometimes even the landscape engineer contributes to that. Because that responsibility is spread out amongst multiple consultants, the buildings in Vancouver don't even meet the code. Most of the commercial buildings, I'll say it again, most of the commercial buildings in Vancouver don't meet Vancouver's energy bylaw for code. So how do we expect them to get to a LEED level of performance without accountability?
But I guess that was the past. As of January and December last year, now we have to demonstrate that we meet. There are forms that we have to fill.
Right. Forms, the city has always had forms that the consultants had to fill.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, but now there is enforcement that we have to submit those now. As per energy code that's been just released.
So the city has never had the capacity to enforce the bylaw. There's no one within the city that has the time to be able to do that. So that's why a lot of municipalities love LEED, because it transferred that responsibility of enforcement to another agency. So that was very popular. And then they got pushback from developers. So we saw equivalency, lead shadows, whatever terminology that you would like to use come up. And that's where things broke apart as far as I'm concerned. I've worked on a lot of equivalency projects, and obviously I've worked on a lot of certified projects, and I can unequivocally say that if it is a private development, not a government owner, that it does not perform to basics of LEED. So we're not getting LEED certified for an equivalency project. I would love for someone to come and give me an example of a building that does.
It complies with the...
Just show me, here's the equivalency, and here's my proof that it actually is equivalent to a LEED project. And that's where the cost comes from. That's where the benefit comes from. That's where you get to actually know that what you built was built to that standard as verified by a third party. So I know that there are a lot of differing opinions on that.
I think to be fair, the nature of the debate yesterday, though, wasn't whether or not there was value in LEED, because I was certainly one of those talking. I think the nature of the debate was, does it or doesn't it cost more? And the points that I made were, number one, it is typically very much of it's a fixed cost. You don't pay 10 times as much to get LEED certified on a building that's 10 times the size. It costs 10 times as much. And so you constantly see people throwing different kinds of percentages up, which may indeed be accurate for their project, but not for the industry at large. And I think the reality is that if you are a developer who is going to flip, for lack of a better term, their building, they're gonna lease it up and sell it to somebody else, or it's a residential building, they're just gonna sell it out. Their level of interest in spending any more money than the bare minimum that the code requires, and notwithstanding your comment about whether or not the building's even built to code, their interest in this just kind of goes away. The other side of it is or isn't this the right thing to do? And I think what was said was that the concept of a third-party verification is really good. The process still needs a whole pile of work.
Yes.
Like a whole pile of work. And I've said to a couple of people here, I'm going to have to eventually put my money where my mouth is and get involved in CADVC, but it is the biggest problem with LEED. I think it's a bigger problem than the cost of LEED, is the process. How long it takes and how, I'll say it again because I said it yesterday, if your consultant is not one of those consultants who's supposed to be incognito reviewing the project, the odds of them getting their project reviewed first time with ticks in every box is slim to none. And I would argue that it becomes an extremely laborious process.
Right.
So that's where the work really needs to be done. And I think even with LEED, because much of it outside the existing building piece is actually focused on the design and construction and not actually on the operation. It's great you can design and build it. Until you actually have run it for a year or two, you really don't know how it's going to perform. And that's a bit of a weakness.
Yes, of a lot of rating systems that are just looking at design and construction. And having been a LEED consultant for very many years, totally familiar with the pitfall, like the sort of glitches within the system and the process. And absolutely it could be improved. And hopefully, I'm hopeful that LEED Online will be an improvement. I have heard there was a little news article of Green Building News, and they did a spoof on April 1st, and they said that the new LEED Online, AKLOL, so I know that it has its glitches too, which hopefully they'll have worked out. And again, I find I spend a lot of my time defending the CAGVC. I'm not on staff there at all, but a lot of the time for certification rests with the design team, the design team's response to the LEED coordinator's request for that documentation, as well as the CAGVC's request for additional information. The vast majority, and we have had projects that have taken years to certify.
I know.
Yes.
Just got one after
4 years. And if you were to ask the design team when the reviews went in, when they got them back, and how long it took to respond to them, you would see, well, you may or may not see on your project that most of the time was with the project team, not sitting with the CAGBC waiting for a paid review team to review it.
And I agree with you, except I think there the problem is that the quality, and again, I said this yesterday, so I'll say it again, there is a lack of clarity on the documentation being provided to the consultants to ensure that what they actually deliver up on to the review team is actually what the review team is going to base their review upon. And that sounds kind of strange, but it's almost like having a set of policies, running a company, and you can see 80% of the policies, but not the other 20%, and the audit's on the whole 100%. So there needs to be that alignment, I think.
Yes.
You know, the biggest problem is when we try to read how to interpret, how to document, it is like getting another university degree. It is too complicated.
The rating system itself, is that what you mean?
LEED, all LEED.
Okay.
If you really look at it, it is so complicated. Why?
And
That is
getting
what is
more
causing problems.
Right. So the fact, well, everything is getting more complicated, right? Our buildings are getting more complicated. Code consulting didn't exist, 20 years ago. Because our codes are getting more complicated, we need another consultant sitting at the table. LEED and other rating systems are like new codes, new green building codes. And if you had asked me when I started this gig of green building consulting, I would have said it's a temporary transition until consultants get up to speed. It has turned out to not be such a temporary transition as what I thought it would be when I started.
But you don't catch up. By the
And
time
then they
you do
change
something,
them.
the new
Yeah.
one comes in. So that is the reasons.
And the LEED is a checklist-based system, right? It was fairly simple in that regard. The requirements, mostly threshold-based, performance-based, and also very simple. But it was the integration of all this together with our normal practices that was kind of the stumbling point, I would say, to adopting LEED easily. Now, what was my point with that? I can't remember. But it is, one of its failings was that simplicity, right? As soon as you have a checklist, and you only have limited options of what you can pursue and what you can't pursue or what won't give you credit, then you fall into the trap of, well, actually, resource reuse is a higher environmental benefit than using something with recycled content, but the rating system doesn't recognize that. You fall into all these traps because of the simplicity, but you make it more complicated, and it's then a harder rating system to apply. So they're constantly trying to juggle this ease of application with the environmental benefit that's actually resulting from the rating system. And so this latest version of LEED takes a jump in complexity, right? Life cycle analysis, who does that? A handful of people. Right? Has anyone here worked on a project where you've done life cycle analysis? Yeah, one, right? So, but this is the direction that the industry has to move in if we are going to not create the environmental damage that we have for the last 100 years with the buildings. And again, where these rating systems go, code follows. Right? So it will then become mandatory. Why don't we know the ingredients in our building materials? It's mandatory that we know the ingredients in our food. Right? You can't sell food in Canada without listing what's in the food. And we'll talk more about that later. So I had intended for this to be a time when we ask questions because I'm going to move from LEED to another topic. So is there any other questions about LEED version 4 or LEED related? Now you're all done with that? Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about facilities management because it really doesn't matter what rating system we use to design and construct a building, 100% of its performance will be based on how it's operated. And I've picked up a few examples here that I did not have to search for. These are examples that you can see in almost any building that you go into. So I like to call this image mixed messages. right? So LEED requires a bicycle rack, right? You have to accommodate for a certain number of bikes. You want to encourage cycling. The facilities has not allowed bikes where the rack is, right? So with that one little piece of signage, they've undone the entire intent behind the design here. And same thing, same facility. I don't know if any of you recognize this. I'm going to name names. This is Hillcrest Community Center. So AC will only work if all windows are shut. I am absolutely positive that that's what the designer intended, right? That your AC will go off when you open the windows so that you can naturally ventilate the space. However, if I'm an occupant and I read that sign, am I going to open that window? No, right? I'm going to fear the wrath of both staff and the facilities manager. So again, one little piece of paper has undone, I don't know how much cost for the operable windows. They'll never be used, and how much energy savings have just been undone with that. That again is Hillcrest Community Center. Does anyone recognize this building? CERS, yeah, I heard it. CERS out at B.Sc. This is a LEED Platinum certified building, and also a living building candidate. And that's the living machine. So for a living building, you have to treat all the wastewater. And they have installed this living machine right in this corner space, front and center of the building. The building has been completed and occupied, I think, since September 2011. And that living system has never operated as it was intended. They can't clean the water of the building through that because, and this is a communication issue, because you need a special certificate in order to operate the living system. Right? You can't operate it without training, and no one at B.Sc has that training, and therefore they can't clean the water using, I don't even want to guess how much that system cost. So hopefully that will be fixed. They will get the training, or they will outsource that to another company. But so that was a miscommunication between the design team and the people that were going to end up operating that building. You need someone on staff who's certified in living systems. So again, a horrendous waste of resources that aren't actually being used, which is the worst environmental scenario. So this example, the City of North Vancouver Library, and we all have our waterless urinal and dual flush toilet stories. In this particular project, new build, the dual flush toilets were backing up. And now there can be dozens of reasons why a dual flush or any toilet might back up. It might be the fixture itself. It might be the plumbing, right? So they use less water. The plumbing has to accommodate that. So all of the pipes need to be sloped more. Their connections need to be Y connections, not T connections. There's a whole bunch of things that go along with this. But they were having issues with blockage in the toilets, and so what they did was they fused the two buttons. So every flush is a full flush. You can't, it's dual flush functionality gone.
But, you know, even in the city of Vancouver, they've gone to 4-liter,
Yeah.
4-liter units. They have not changed the code for the size of pipes.
Yes.
They have not changed the code for going to Ys instead of Ts. And the reality is those design parameters were based on whatever it was, 12-liter flushes. So you don't have to be a rocket science, and nor do you probably want to think about it very long to figure out that Houston, we've got a problem.
Exactly.
And I think this is just another example that the right hand may say, I will put in a low flush toilet, but then you give it to the poor people operating the building
And they get
it's a disaster. And so we've actually seen this over and over and over again. And I've actually written a letter to get the code changed, because that's what actually has to happen. I mean, that's the code. Forget about just going to these folks. That's the code. This is lunacy what's going on right now. And so we can't, it'd be a bit like going into a car and changing the transmission but not the motor and hoping you kind of see two things together and it just kind of work.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody would ever try doing that. This is the equivalent for buildings. And we've actually incurred, I hate to tell you, but tens of thousands of dollars of damage to our buildings as a result of following code.
Right. And
Code is minimum.
yeah, I agree.
Code may be minimum, but I think the thing is that the minimum has to change. You can't just change one part of it
Right.
without the rest of that.
Yeah, the infrastructure that supports all of these new technologies has to be in place
Yeah.
or they will fail. And then who's left to deal with that? The facilities manager.
And the restoration companies.
Right.
Brenda, just to the point of, a handoff, I think part of the problem is the culture of handoff and deferred responsibility. And the fact that the operations manager is not at the design table, I think, is a huge part of that problem.
And they should be.
And they should be.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
And the project doesn't fund any transition, handover training, and operational performance.
That's correct. Yeah. So there's not those additional fees to the consultant to be able to interact with whoever's operating the building to let them know. There's no training. And that is an issue. And so what we have is the default operating condition won't be the most energy efficient mode, but the one with the fewest complaints, right? Regardless of what that means in terms of the building performance. And this is what we see. So in addition to the training, I think that another best management practice would be to change from what our typical operations is, and that's to have a facility manager have a number of contractors who support them in the operations of their building, but they only interact with those individuals one at a time for the different systems, to switch to an integrated operations. So we're designing these buildings, all of the systems are supposed to work together, right? They're supposed to be optimized together, and then they're being operated individually as individual building systems. So we need to have that interaction between all of the people that manage those individual systems. They need to discuss, right, the building as a whole system, not just their one individual component. And I don't know of any organization that's transitioned to this type of operating mode. Yeah. So I would consider this to be a future best practice of
We do
facilities.
it.
What's that?
We do it.
You do it. Excellent.
But that's because our operations people are in the same functional area of the company as the design people.
Are you Man City?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Nice to meet you. Okay, so Living Building Challenge. It's not likely that the Living Building Challenge will become code anytime soon. However, it can inform design, and that's the intent. So the metaphor is of a flower, because a flower is rooted in place. It can't move to get its resources. It has to get all of its water, sunlight, energy, etc. from where it is. And that's the same as a building needs to be in order to be sustainable. It's specific to its climate and its site. So I shouldn't see a building in Vancouver that looks exactly like a building in the Okanagan, because those are two different climates, right? We're in a rainforest here, and they're in semi-arid desert there. You would want the two buildings to be appropriate to the climate and site. It should operate pollution-free. Flowers don't create pollution unless you have allergies and the pollen is bothersome. And it's all one system, right? All those systems are integrated, and it's beautiful. So there are 7 categories. It's arranged much like the other green building rating systems. It's into categories of different areas that you're looking at. The first is site, water, energy, health, materials, equity, and the final one is beauty. And I will just go through, there's 2 rules for the Living Building Challenge. All imperatives assigned to a typology, and we'll get to typologies, are mandatory. So it's not prerequisites and credits. Everything within the Living Building Challenge, if you wanted to obtain that designation for your project, is mandatory. And it's based on actual rather than modeled performance. So that addresses the question of, well, you've only looked at the design and construction. It's not performing as it should. So again, you can't get Living Building Challenge certification without a year's worth of data showing that you've met the requirements of all of these different categories. They have a number, these are the typologies. So you can get a Living Building Challenge designation for a renovation, for landscape and infrastructure, for an entire building, and for a neighborhood. And the requirements under each are different because some parts of it will apply and some parts won't. For instance, landscape and infrastructure would be very different than a renovation in terms of materials. And then it looks at the areas in which these projects are being built. There's the natural habitat or preserve, a rural agricultural zone, a village, a general urban zone, urban center, and an urban core. So those are the different conditions under which a Living Building Challenge project can exist. And again, they modify the requirements based on those different scenarios. It allows scale jumping. So we'll see under energy that net zero energy is a requirement. It allows you to achieve that net zero energy with the use of a district energy system because that often makes more sense than each individual building trying to get to net zero energy. So what is required for the site? Limits to growth. You cannot develop on greenfield or farmland or next to ecologically sensitive land and expect to get a Living Building designation. The idea here, we've co-opted enough space for development already, and we shouldn't be taking any more. So all of those requirements have to be achieved. Urban agriculture. Depending on the density of your project and the scale of it, you need to provide the occupants with access to urban agriculture. Habitat exchange. For your site area, you have to put in reserve an equivalent amount of land in habitat preservation, with a Habitat Preservation Society, ensuring that that land will never be developed. So for every little bit of land that we redevelop, we have to put another aside of equivalent size for nature, because we have co-opted the land, so we have to make sure that there's some there left. Now, car-free living doesn't mean that your project has to be pedestrian only. That refers to designing such that the occupants can live there without a car. So it refers to the people, not the site. So Alan Wallace was talking about that this morning with bringing in industry, commercial, residential together. So that would meet the requirements of that imperative. It's looking at the people being car-free, being able to live car-free within your project. So if you were to achieve all of those, you would earn the site petal. It's referred to as petals because of the metaphor of a flower. The water, there's only two imperatives, net zero water and ecological water flow. So net zero water means that 100% of the water used by the occupants or irrigation, etc. on the site has to come from the site. So that means you're either using rainwater or you're recycling the water of the occupants' use for reuse, 100%. So net zero water. And if you are treating that water on site, which obviously if you are going to meet this, you're going to need to treat the water, whether it's on site or uses that scale jumping and goes slightly off site, both are okay. But if you're treating that water, it has to be purified without the use of chemicals. Again, going beyond what we currently do, we just pile chlorine into our water in order to kill whatever is in there, beneficial or not, doesn't matter. So the treatment has to be chemical-free. That's why you saw that living system at SERS. That's how they chose to treat the water there. And then 100% of the stormwater that falls on site, you either have to use, as mentioned, or it goes to infiltration. None of it can go to the municipal sewer system or storm system. Right? So you're basically accountable for all of the water that falls in your site, either being infiltrated as it would be if there was no building there, or flowing as it would in nature off the site, but not into the municipal system. So those are the two imperatives under water. For energy, there's only one imperative. and that is net zero energy, which is 100% of the project's energy needs must be supplied by on-site renewable energy on a net annual basis. And the on-site, again, they all scale jumping, so you can view it within a district energy system. And the net annual means that you can produce more energy at one time of the year than you use, and that surplus goes to the time of year where you would use more energy than you produce. And so a lot of energy, typically in the summertime, goes to pay your deficit in the winter. So that's what they mean by net zero energy, because there's lots of different definitions of net zero energy out there. And that's the only thing that you need for that title. For health, a civilized environment, healthy air, and biophilia. So the civilized environment, every occupiable interior space must have operable windows that provide access to fresh air and daylight. And hopefully they don't have a sign on them telling you not to open them. So that's civilized environment. Healthy air, you have to do an indoor air quality test when the building is built, and then again 8 months later, because people can introduce a lot of substances into the environment that might not be healthy, regardless of what materials you chose when you built the actual building. So 9 months right after occupancy. The project has to incorporate elements that nurture our attraction to nature, right? So not necessarily a plant, but something that could be in natural shape or forms, natural patterns. So something that feeds that human desire for our connection to nature. And then materials. The materials section of Living Building Challenge is the most challenging and the area in which we have the most work to do. So the red list, has anyone here heard of the red list? Yeah. It's a list of the worst in class chemicals that we typically use in our buildings worldwide. So some of these things have been banned for use in Canada, like asbestos, although we still mine and export asbestos to other countries that haven't banned it. These are chemicals that typically appear in building materials that are all harmful, known to be harmful to our health, either carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, or have other harmful effects. So lead, PVC, cadmium, you will find these in a lot of building materials. Treated wood. So it is very difficult, extremely difficult to try and eliminate those commonly occurring chemicals from the materials that we choose. Embodied carbon footprint. So we often look at the energy use of the building, but we don't look at the manufacturing energy that went into producing everything that was required for that building. And as we get more energy efficient buildings, the embodied energy will actually be the highest energy use for our buildings. So there has to be a one-time offset of all the embodied carbon of the construction. So all the materials that went into it, there's calculators out there where you calculate the embodied energy and the CO2, and you have to offset that with a single purchase. A responsible industry looks at mining and harvesting forestry, and it requires a third-party certification of those practices to ensure that sustainable practices are being used. So for wood, FSC is the only certification that's accepted for this. And so it ensures that the forest is managed sustainably, and it ensures that the wood from that forest is the one that ends up on your project. Right? If it's mining, like if you're using a stone product, it also has to be certified, because a lot of damage goes on in mining for materials. We think of the material as inert, but it's already created a lot of damage before it gets to the actual building. Appropriate sourcing is the distance requirement. So I'll just say here that the heavier the material is, the closer to the project it has to be sourced. And the combination of appropriate sourcing and the red list is like the 1-2 punch of trying to achieve the materials pedal of the Living Building Challenge. It makes it extremely difficult in our current industry to actually do that. And then conservation and reuse. This looks at the waste during design. So you're supposed to try and design out waste from your project with standard heights that don't require cutoffs of drywall or whatever it might be. It looks at the construction waste, the operation waste, so the building in operation, the waste that's produced, and also the end of life. You are to give some thought to how the building can be disassembled at the end of its useful life. And then equity. Not a lot of our green building rating systems include the social aspect, but this living building challenge does. So human scale and humane places, democracy and social justice, rights to nature. So the human scale and humane places means that it has to be human-centered design as opposed to automobile-centered design. So they're actually showing you what you don't want to do on this slide here. The democracy and social justice, all of the amenities that are part of your project, the exterior amenities, have to be accessible to everyone regardless of their age, income, social status, etc. So a gated community could never become a living building challenge certified project. Rights to nature. You cannot block off the access to water, sunlight, fresh air to other members of the society, so to adjacent properties, etc. You can't shade them beyond a certain amount. You can't, if you're a waterfront resort, that waterfront has to be accessible to everyone. So you have to provide everyone with equal access to nature. And then beauty. So two imperatives under this category. Because we all know if we design something with no regard for the aesthetic, chances are that that design won't wear out, it will ugly out, right? So it will require replacement due to aesthetics rather than any loss of functionality. So again, paying attention, the project has to contain design features intended for the delight of humans and the celebration of culture, spirit, and place. And the inspiration and education, you have to publish information about your living building challenge so that other projects can learn from it. This is the award plaque for a living building challenge. You can get certification in particular categories. You can get a waters material certification if you just do those. You don't have to get every single petal to get a partial certification. And so within each of those, you would get this little plaque that says which of the petals you earned. If you've got it, flaunt it. They also have a net zero energy building certification, separate from the Living Building Challenge. Here's the uptake, and of course you can see the Pacific Northwest is the highest uptake because of course that's where the standard originated, was here. But there are projects all over the world. If you looked at the volume, it would clearly not be anything near to the number of square feet that LEED certified buildings or registered buildings have. But the intent here is to prove that it's possible. So many of you will be familiar with this statue. Okay. Who is it?
That's that code?
It's a 4-minute mile.
Miracle Mile.
4-minute mile, right? It's at the Pacific National Exhibition, right? And this is Roger Bannister and John Lambie. Both of them completed the race that this is depicting in under 4 minutes, breaking the psychological barrier. Well, he had already broken it, but the 4-minute mile broke the psychological barrier, right, of us believing that we couldn't do it. The Living Building Challenge is intended to do the same. Right? Break that psychological barrier. We can't do net zero, we can't do net zero water, or net zero energy, or have healthy interiors, or the red list. So that's what it's aimed at. These are some of the projects that have certified or are candidates to certify. In the Lower Mainland, we have the University Childcare up at SFU. There's also the SERS building, as I mentioned, out at UBC, and the Okanagan Center of Excellence in the Okanagan for the college there, as well as Van Dusen Garden. So those are all living building candidate projects that have not yet met the designation in operation. eye candy. That's SIRS. And all of the information about the Living Building Challenge is available for free on the website. So this is something that you could incorporate into your projects now if you chose to. And one of the biggest impacts that the Living Building Challenge has had is on the materials side. So declare just the healthy building resources. I'm not saying that right. These are all systems where products can, manufacturers I should say, can tell you what's in their products. Right? Very important. Statistically, and Kevin mentioned this morning, you want to leave your workplace healthier than when you arrived. We're not there yet, especially in terms of the toxicity of the materials that we use. Worldwide, workplace disease is a higher cause of death than workplace accident. Right? So more people die of the toxins that they're exposed to in the workplace than die by accident, any type of accident, falling, electrocution, having something fall on you, etc. And in the construction industry, you would think that that would be reversed, that more people would die by accident. The construction industry is actually one of the most disproportionate in terms of people dying by workplace disease. So 70% of all construction workplace-related deaths are from disease. The remaining 30% are by accident. What's going to happen in the future, and this talks to the ease of certification. A few years ago, and I'll wrap up very quickly here, a few years ago we saw our first submissions for LEED coming in Revit. And it's a lot easier if your software already has all of the area of the exterior glazing for, say, daylight calculations, all the area of exterior glazing and floor areas, the transmittance, and you're basically just putting in a calculation and it does it automatically to give you your daylight documentation. Right? So the future, I think, for any rating system is to be able to tie into these building information systems and be able to get the documentation directly from it. And for that declare, we now have online sites of materials databases. Right? So all of the all the manufacturers that have declared what's in their products, that's all online. Wouldn't it be great if your model had all that material information, accessed the online database, and automatically created the submissions that are required for certification for any of the rating systems? So that's where I think the future. That's where I hope the future of certification is going to. That it will tie seamlessly into our building information systems. Management, people have heard of the Internet of Things. By 2020, 100 billion devices will be connected to the internet, and it won't just be phones, computers, tablets, etc. It will be cars, pacemakers, buildings, which are already cited, and all of that information will be analyzed by online software, which will then feed back a text to the property manager. And instead of rings and rings of data, they'll get a text saying, tell the cleaning staff to close the windows because they've been left open. Right, so it will greatly simplify that. And fortunately, we're going to hear from Nick after this about that very thing. So that concludes. Thanks for your attention.